All right, we all know how this works. Somebody steps up on a stage and babbles on and tries to explain something or argue something. Maybe it's true, maybe it's false, maybe it's clear and concise, maybe it's incoherent and confusing, maybe you agree with it, maybe you don't. But either way, your job is to sit there and shut up and listen to somebody else throw their opinion at you. That's how speeches work. That's not what I'm going to do today. Because what I hope to convey today to the people here and anybody who ever sees a video of this is actually something that most people already, for the most part, know. It's not something they need to be taught by me. I don't want to give you an understanding of something new. I want to bring out of anybody who ever hears this talk something that's been in there their whole life. And they didn't need to get it from me. So most of this speech is not going to be me saying things and making statements. It's going to be me asking you things. And by you, I mean the people here who probably for the most part are pretty much already on my side, but also all the people who will ever see this, a lot of whom are not familiar with what this event's about and all that. Now, you don't have to answer these questions out loud. Just answer them to yourself inside your own head. Instead of me telling you what you should believe for this talk, I prefer that you tell me what you believe in and what you care about and what you think the world ought to be. Now, I'm going to ask you some things you may never have thought about before, at least not exactly the way I'm asking them. But hey, if I'm just asking you what you think and what you believe, how painful could that possibly be? So here we go. Let's start with the idea of morality and right and wrong. I don't want to get into the intricacies of exactly what does it mean and where does it come from and how do you define it and how do you determine it. I want to keep this pretty basic. So to begin with, do you believe there is such a thing as good and bad, as right and wrong, as things that people should do and things that people shouldn't do? Most of us agree in some form or other of that, of morality, even if we disagree about details and even if we disagree about exact definitions. But I have a few questions about this thing called morality. Does it apply the same to everyone? Now, I'm not asking if we all have the same opinions about what is moral and what isn't. Obviously, there are differences. There's also a lot of overlap between us, which we agree on basics, but we might nitpick about some of the details. I'm asking, do you, listener, believe that this thing called morality applies to everybody? For example, if you believe it's bad to murder, do you believe it's bad to murder unless you're a redhead born on a Tuesday? Or do you believe if it's bad to murder, it's bad for anybody to murder? Does it apply to anybody, to everybody? You tell me. Next question, is morality a popularity contest? Is right and wrong determined by how many people think something? Or is it an objective, separate thing? For example, once upon a time, if a whole bunch of people in an area thought that slavery is perfectly fine, does that make it perfectly fine, or were they all wrong? You tell me. Next question, can morality be altered? I don't mean can you change your opinion about it, obviously that happens. I mean, is there anything you can do to make something bad into something good, or vice versa? Is there some document or some ritual that could, for example, make murder into a good thing? You tell me. Now, I have a few questions having to do with physical force, human beings using force against other human beings. Would you agree, to start with something simple and obvious and stupid, would you agree it's not okay, it's not good for someone to just randomly go around violently attacking people? Hopefully we'd all agree on that. So there are obviously times when physical force is a bad thing, when it's immoral and unjustified. But the next question is, do you think there are times when one person using physical force against someone else is moral and justified? If some mugger is trying to steal a purse with a little old lady and the little old lady decides to smack him on the head with her umbrella, is that okay? Does she have the right to do that? I think she does, but You tell me. If you believe that such defensive force can be justified to stop someone else who's doing something wrong, the next question is it okay to use physical force to stop anyone from doing anything wrong? If someone is doing anything rude or stupid or nasty or somehow bad in some way, does that automatically make it okay to use physical force, violence, to stop them? For example, I don't think people should try to live on a diet of only cheesecake and soda. I think it's stupid, unhealthy, and a bad idea for a number of reasons. However, if someone does choose to have such a diet, does choose to do that to themselves, do you think that I would therefore have the right to use force against them because of it, to try to stop them? I don't think I have that right, but you tell me. What if I say it's for their own good? Suppose that I think that your diet is less than ideal, and I proclaim that for the sake of your health, I'm going to punch you in the face if I see you eating junk food. Would that be justified? I don't think it would be, but you tell me. But hey, it might make you healthier. It might be for your own good. It might make you live longer. You might benefit from it. Hey, you might even thank me. Probably not, but you don't know. Would any of that make it okay? Personally, I don't think it would. I think it would be wrong for me to use force in that way, but you tell me. So, like I said, this is pretty dang basic stuff so far. Assuming we're all still on the same page here, is it safe to say that there are two categories of shouldn't we can talk about? There are things that people shouldn't do, such as randomly violently assaulting people, which are such a bad shouldn't that other people have the right to use force to try to stop them from doing it. But there's another big category of shouldn't, where people probably shouldn't do things, but like eating too much junk food, but that doesn't justify a violent response. It's a shouldn't that you have to just let people be free to do those things that they maybe shouldn't, but it isn't attacking anybody else. From here on in, I'll mostly be asking questions about the first kind, the kind of shouldn't that is so bad that force is justified to stop it. A quick aside, would you agree that generally speaking, carjacking is not a nice thing? It's not okay to point a gun in some random person's face and demand their car keys. Hopefully we agree that's not okay. But what about the argument that the carjacker didn't actually use violence? If he comes up to you and says, give me your car keys, and in order to avoid death, you give him your car keys, he didn't shoot you. He didn't even touch you. He threatened you. But he didn't actually use the physical violence. Does that make it okay? You tell me. I don't know very many people who think that's okay. So now we have to include the threat of violence as one of those shouldn'ts that is such a shouldn't that sometimes you have to use force to stop that. For example, do you believe that if somebody merely threatens violence against you, you have the right to use actual defensive force to stop them? For example, if he pulls a knife, says, give me your car keys, do you have the right to punch him in the face to keep him from taking your car? I think you do, but you tell me. He only threatened it. You use actual force. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, whatever. What if instead of using force or threatening you, he just sneaks into your garage in the middle of the night and hotwires your car and drives away with it? He didn't use force. He didn't even use the threat of force. He was nowhere near you. You didn't even know he was there. Would that also justify force? Is that a bad enough shouldn't? Is theft a bad enough shouldn't that it justifies to use force to stop it? I think in a lot of cases it is, but you tell me. What if he didn't even steal it? He came to you and said, hey, buddy, I want to buy your car for this many $1,000s. And you're like, really? It's not that good, but okay. And he writes you a check, and you hand him the keys, and he drives away because you're kind of gullible and not paying attention. And the check bounces. and you find out he knew that was going to happen. He didn't use force. You gave him the keys. You let him drive away. He used fraud. Is fraud one of those kinds of shouldn't that is bad enough that, for example, it would be justified for you to go take back your car by force because he didn't pay for it? I think it can be. Maybe you don't. You tell me. So far, this is obvious, basic stuff. So let's continue with a few questions about the whole category of nastiness, those really bad shouldn'ts, violent aggression, theft, fraud, things like that. And hopefully we all agree you shouldn't do those things, and I think most of us would agree that it can be justified to use force to prevent people from doing those things. Oh, to throw this in, do you believe you have the right to use defensive force to stop someone else from being victimized by, aggression, violence, assault, theft, fraud? Or is it only if it's yourself? Now, maybe you'd be too scared or you wouldn't bother to save somebody else. I'm not asking if you have the obligation to run off and save everybody in the world. I'm just asking, would you have the moral right to protect somebody else, to use force to stop someone else from being victimized? I think you would. But you tell me. Okay, when it comes to these especially nasty things, these very bad shouldn'ts, assault, robbery, so on and so forth, I think most of us agree it's not okay to do this. What if instead of doing these things yourself, you get someone else to do it for you? Is that okay? Is that good? Is it only wrong if you're doing it yourself? For example, let's say you decide that it's not really okay for you to kill your neighbor and take his stuff. But instead, you decide, what if I hire some thug to do that for me? And I'll tell the thug, like, when my neighbor is home and when he isn't, and I'll tell him where he hides the key, and I'll say, I'll make this deal. You go in, kill him, take his stuff, and we'll divide up his stuff. And hey, I'm not doing anything. I just said words to this thug guy. I didn't go over there. I didn't do anything to my neighbor. I didn't take his stuff. Does that make it okay? I think it does not make it okay. But you tell me, is the guy blameless who got somebody else to do it for him? Well, what if he paid him? He paid the thug. Does that make it any better? Does that make it any worse? To put it another way, if it's wrong for you to do a certain thing, is it any better for you to get somebody else to do that certain thing for you? I'm going to ask this again because this is a very important point. As much as it seems bleeding obvious right now, this is very important. If it's wrong for you to do a certain thing, is it also wrong for you to get somebody else to do the same thing for you? I think it is still wrong, but you tell me. Now, what about the idea of the common good, or the greatest good for the greatest number of people? You may have heard that phrase before. Let's say you have one neighbor who has a whole bunch of money, and you and 5 or 6 of your other neighbors say, let's go beat him up and take his stuff and divvy it up amongst ourselves. Because, hey, 6 or 7 of us are going to benefit, and only one of us is going to suffer. Does that make it okay? If the majority is better off and only a minority suffers, the common good, does that make it okay? I don't think it does. But you tell me. I suspect that if you're in the minority about to be victimized, you're pretty likely to say it's not okay. But even if you're in the majority, would you be okay with victimizing a minority just to improve your own situation and serve your own interests? I don't think so. You tell me. Now, while we're at it, what about the notion that the ends justifies the means? These nasty things, assault, theft, fraud, what if by victimizing one person or even a few people, lots of other people benefit? Maybe even the ones being victimized benefit eventually. Would that make it okay? Don't worry, in the long run, this will be okay, that I'm beating you up and stealing your stuff. Let's return to the hypothetical of me being a health Nazi. If I rob you at gunpoint and use the money to buy you healthier food than you would have bought for yourself, and then I use threats of violence to control your behavior, maybe I'll force you to exercise. I'll chase you around making you exercise at gunpoint 3 times a week. That's good. That's fair. Would that be okay? Would that be moral? It's for your own good. Now, if a year later your physical health is actually significantly improved, does that retroactively make it okay? Does the ends justify the means? Hey, you got better, your health's better, what are you complaining about? Is it okay to do those otherwise nasty things if, in the long run, it's for their own good or it benefits them in some way? I don't think it is, but you tell me. Do you want people treating you that way? Do you want people violently controlling you and assuring you that, don't worry, this is for your own good. In the end, you'll thank me. I don't really want to be treated that way, but you tell me if you're okay with that. Now, with these people in front of me right now, and thousands more who will see the video later, I'm sure we would get some different answers to at least some of the details of some of the questions I've asked so far, as basic as they are. Nonetheless, it's pretty simple stuff so far, and I bet most of you on most of these questions, we're all still on the same page. Even all those people in internet land who will see this later. But now, just for a bit, I want to talk just to those of you who are all on the same page on that one important issue. If it's not okay for you to do a certain thing, then it's not okay for you to get someone else to do it for you. Again, it's a very basic idea, and almost everybody I know says, duh, that's obvious. What's the problem with that? Just as a test, in here, can I get a show of hands of the people who agree that if it's not okay for you to do it, you shouldn't get somebody else to do it for you? Pretty dang much everybody, and I think that's most of the population too. Like, oh, he hired somebody to kill his wife. Oh yeah, but he only hired them, so I think most of us recognize that's really bad. It might even be worse because you're too much of a coward to do it yourself. So you're an accomplice to murder and a coward so whatever. But you tell me if you think it's perfectly okay. All right, you can have that opinion. So let's go back to the example of somebody killing his neighbor and taking his stuff. And let's say he's scared to or whatever, and he hires somebody else to do it to him. Do it instead. When someone hires a thug to do a nasty deed for him, who do you think is more culpable? The thug who actually did it, or the guy who hired him to do it, or both? And this is a thing I've heard disagreement on among a bunch of different people, and I've seen discussions about it that, well, the guy who hired him, it was his idea, he initiated it. Well, yeah, but the guy who did it is the one who actually did it. If he didn't do it, it wouldn't have happened. And I've seen people argue back and forth. And about the only commonality I see is pretty much everybody agrees they're both pretty dang bad. Some people may say the guy who hired him is even worse. Some people would say, no, the guy who actually did it is even worse. But mostly people agree it's pretty dang bad. But you tell me, which do you think is worse? Or are they equally bad? Okay, see, that wasn't so painful. I asked you some questions about what you thought about concepts of morality, and there was nothing particularly uncomfortable yet. Now we get to the uncomfortable part. So, you shouldn't beat people up and steal their stuff. Duh. You shouldn't ask someone else to do it for you. You shouldn't pay someone else to do it for you. And a bunch of people getting somebody else to do it for them isn't okay either. What if instead you vote for someone to do it for you? If it's wrong for you to do a certain thing, is it any less wrong for you to vote by way of the political process for someone else to do it for you? You tell me. If we call it something different, if we decide to call it democracy and representative government and legislation and taxation and law enforcement, then is it okay to ask someone else to do something for you that you know would be wrong if you did it yourself? You tell me. And I really want you to think about this because it's a pretty simple concept, but this is not something you're going to hear discussed by all the pundits and the politicians for obvious reasons. What have you voted to have government do? And is it something that you would have the right to do yourself? For example, do you have the right on your own? Let's say you have kids and they're going to school and you're looking at how expensive school is and you go, oh, wow. And you go to your neighbor and say, hey, neighbor, you're going to help me pay for my kid's education. Give me a couple $100 or I'm going to chase you out of your house at gunpoint. You have the right to do that. I think most of us agree that's not okay. How about if you hire a thug and say, hey, thug, here's $50. Go get $200 from my neighbor. Tell him if he doesn't hand over money to help me pay for my kid's education, you're going to chase him out of his house at gunpoint. Is that okay? Is that any better than the first one? I don't think it is. You tell me. What if you vote for a school board or a township to impose property taxes on your neighbor that says, we don't care if you have kids, you are going to hand over this money that is going to help pay for this school for this person's kid to go to, and if you don't, the sheriff and men with guns will show up at your house and will chase you out of your house. And I mean that quite literally. And I know lots of cases where it's happened, quite literally. They will show up. It takes a while. There's a bunch of paperwork in between. But they will show up with guns and say, get out of your house. If it's not okay to do that yourself, and it's not okay to just hire some random thug to do it, is it okay to vote for government to do it? Is calling it different things, democracy and legislation and the will of the people, does that make it okay to basically get somebody else to take money from your neighbor by force to help pay for your kid's education? Is that okay? You tell me. Do you, on your own, have the right to go door to door and say, hey, do you have any of those scary looking guns? Because those guns sort of scare me and I don't really want them in my neighborhood. If you have them, let me know, and you're going to have to turn them over. And me and a bunch of guys with other scary guns are going to take them from you if you have them. Do you have the right to do that on your own? Now, there's the other question of, are you dumb enough to try that? But aside from whether it's a good idea on a practical basis, do you have the moral right to do that to just complete strangers? Just go to door and say, I'm taking your guns because they sort of scare me. You tell me. Do you have the right to hire a bunch of people to go do it for you? You know where this is headed. Do you have the right to vote for government to send men with guns to people who say, you're not allowed to have that anymore? You haven't threatened anybody, you haven't harmed anybody, but we decided you're not allowed to have that, and we're going to come to your house if we know you have it, and we're going to take it by force. Do you have the right to vote for somebody to do that for you when you know you have no right to do it yourself? You know you have no right to hire a thug to do it for you. Does it make it any better if you do it by way of vote? You tell me. What if you think certain habits aren't okay? You know, maybe you think, I think beer drinking is a scourge on this, blah, 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 blah. Maybe you think pot smoking is a scourge on blah, blah, blah. Or smoking at all, or eating too much junk food or whatever. Do you have the right to go into your neighbor's house and say, yeah, you're doing this habit in your own living room and stuff, but I think it's so bad for you that I'm going to forcibly interfere and stop you from doing that? Do you have the right to do that on your own? You tell me. Do you have the right to hire a thug to do it for you? Does that make it any better? You tell me. Do you have the right to vote for a government to do it for you when you have no right to do it yourself? Now, there may be some clever people who say, what if I just vote to have government protect the innocent? Because I have the right to protect the innocent. I just want them to do that. I just want them to use that defensive force you were talking about to stop the bad guys. Ha-ha. Okay. while you on your own are defending the innocent, do you have the right to go door to door and make people pay you for it? Do you have the right to vote for somebody to tax your neighbors, demand money from them, to fund this protecting of the innocent? Does that make it any better than you doing it yourself? Let me ask this. Do you believe it's okay for you to be forced to fund things that you are morally opposed to, that you're against? If for whatever reason you're strongly against something government does, a certain war or marijuana prohibition or whatever it is, do you think it would be okay for me personally to force you to pay for that thing that you don't want? I don't think it would be, but you tell me. I might want to support some things you don't want to support, and vice versa. But do you think I should hire a thug? Do you think it's okay for me to hire a thug or to vote for a government to force you to fund things that you're against just because I want it? Is that moral? Is that civilized? I don't think it is. I don't think you should be forced to fund anything you're opposed to. But hey, you tell me if you think that's okay. Now, if you're none too keen on me voting for you to be forced to fund things that you're morally opposed to, let's flip it around. Do you think it's okay for you to vote for me to be forced to fund things that you might want but that I'm against? Now, if this is starting to feel a little bit unfamiliar and uncomfortable to some of you, good. It's important that sometimes people think about ideas that make them uncomfortable. And I'm just asking what you think. You can answer however you want. I'm not even going to hear your answers. I don't even know you. The only one who needs to approve of your answers is you. For example, maybe you do think it's okay for you to vote for me to be forced to fund things that I don't want. Maybe you think you know better than me and it's something super important and necessary and urgent and there's just too much at stake for me to be allowed to decide for myself where my money goes. So you want me forced to pay for stuff that I don't want. Maybe that's your answer. Remember the scenario from before where someone hired a thug to do some nasty deed, and we were pondering who is the most responsible? Is it the thug who actually does it or the guy who hired him, or both? Let's put that into a legal context. When people voted to have laws upholding the institution of slavery, and then law enforcers used violence against those who resisted, whether runaway slaves or other people trying to help them escape, who deserves blame for that? I mean, the voters back then could just say, hey, I didn't do any of it. I just expressed my voice by voting for the policy I prefer. I didn't do it. I just went into a button and wrote down a name or something. Don't blame me. Meanwhile, the lawmakers say, hey, don't blame us. We're just doing the will of the people. They voted for it. They voted us into office. We're just doing what we were elected to do. Don't blame us. And the law enforcers say, hey, we don't make the laws. We just enforce them. We're just following orders. Don't blame us. So abracadabra, you have widespread institutionalized oppression and evil, and no one is responsible for it. Everyone blames someone else. So you tell me, in that example, and it's not hypothetical, in the US, slavery was legal for a very long time, and it was enforced by the government. You tell me, who's to blame for evils like that when they occur? Is it the voters? Is it the politicians? Is it the cops? Is it all of the above? Is it nobody? Massive evil, but nobody's to blame. The guilt gets spread out until it just sort of evaporates and everybody says it's somebody else's fault. Let me do a quick side point here. If you're not merely a voter, but an actual agent of the state yourself, a cop, a soldier, regulator, tax collector, inspector, whatever, do you do things that you would not feel justified in doing if you were just doing them on your own? This is just the other side of the same issue. If it's not okay to ask someone else to do something you shouldn't do yourself, Is it okay for you to do something just because somebody else told you to? For those of you who are not familiar with Stanley Milgram's experiments on the obedience to authority, I highly recommend you read the book Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram. It's no secret that just following orders has been the excuse given by the enforcers of the worst tyrannies in history. So, governments do horrible things, and nobody claims personal responsibility. Not the people who voted for it, not the lawmakers who legislated it, and not the law enforcers who physically use violence to make it happen. Is that okay? Is that how society should be? You tell me. And are there any limits? Throughout history and under all sorts of regimes and ruling classes, slavery has been legalized, terrorism has been legalized, torture and murder have been legalized. Now, hopefully you haven't voted for anything that obviously heinous, but what have you voted for? Have you, by way of your vote, advocated that government do things to your neighbors that you know would be wrong if you did them yourself? Let's say you just vote for help for the poor. What could be wrong with that? Do you on your own have the right to go demand money under threat of, I'm going to take your property or I'm going to put you in a cage so I can give it to the poor? Do you think that's okay? Maybe you do. You tell me. Do you have the right to hire somebody else? Do you have the right to vote for somebody else to do that for you? Is that actual charity? You tell me. Have you ever voted for things you know would have been wrong if you had done them yourself? I did. About a quarter of a century ago, before my views of things underwent a rather drastic transformation, I already imagined myself to be an advocate of freedom and justice, and yet I was still voting to have other people, agents of government, doing things that I knew full well I had no right to do myself. Never occurred to me to actually consider the very basic idea we're talking about. It's not okay for me to do it. Why would it be okay for me to ask somebody else to do it for me, even if it's by way of a vote? I voted to have people forced by way of taxation to fund things that I thought were important and necessary, whether the person being taxed agreed or not. I voted to have government forcibly controlling and limiting people's behaviors and their choices in ways that I had no right to control and limit them myself. But hey, it was for their own good, or the good of society or something. It was necessary, it was desperate. For me, I'm just speaking for myself here, for me, this thing called government and the game called politics back then was essentially permission for me to condone immoral violence in the name of law. And I did just that. It was a guilt-free way for me to advocate violence against nonviolent people while hiding behind the notion of democracy and law. As long as I was asking lawmakers and law enforcers to do it for me, I wasn't to blame. This is just the system we have. This is how it works. I'm not to blame for whatever harm my vote might have contributed to. Now I know I was very, very wrong about that. And now I'm ashamed that I ever thought that and ever did that. And of course, apologizing for it now doesn't undo the damage that has been done with my approval and with my blessing at the time. But at the very least, I will never do it again. I will never again advocate that anyone do anything that I wouldn't feel justified in doing myself. Now, you don't need to answer to my conscience. Like, who am I? Who cares if you have the approval of my moral code? I just am asking these questions because I want to know whether, if you really think about it, your own actions deserve the approval of your own moral code. When you look carefully at what you have voted for, when you really think about the real world consequences of things that you have voted to have forced on real people by way of laws and policies that you support, Is your conscience clean? Mine is now. And that's not a rhetorical question, and it's not a question I can answer for you. Okay, just in case these questions haven't made you uncomfortable enough yet, let's get to the bottom line here. I've asked some stuff about what you advocate politically, what you voted to have the law force on people, but there's actually a more profound topic. Let's just dive right in. Do you think it's ever okay for you to break the law? Should you disobey a law if you think it's immoral?
Yes.
And I'm not just talking about like driving 10 miles an hour over the speed limit or something. I mean a law that commands you to do something that you know is wrong, or forbids you from doing something that you know is right. Let's start with a more comfortable version by talking about other times and other places. If you lived in Stalin's Russia, Hitler's Germany, Mao's China, or some other openly authoritarian regime, do you think you would have a moral right to disobey their dictates, their laws? Or do you think you would be morally obligated to obey whatever those regimes enacted, as long as they enacted them as law through the legislative process? And keep in mind, most of the evil crap those regimes did, they first enacted as law. They made it legal, and then they did it. I think most of us can agree that under those regimes, in those times, in those places, the lawbreakers were often the good guys, and the law enforcers were often the bad guys. In fact, the worst people in the world. Whether you have dared to disobey or not, that's a different question. Maybe you would have been too scared. But I'm guessing you can easily think of situations in which you think you would have the moral right to have stood up to those commands from those political authorities. That it would have been justified and righteous for you to disobey and resist. Let's move this a bit closer to home. Different time, but not so different place, even though we're down in Mexico at the moment. I think most of us are from the U.S. When slavery was legal in the U.S., do you believe the ones enforcing slavery were the good guys, the law enforcers? If you lived in that time, would you have had the moral right to disobey the law? It was illegal to teach a slave to read. It was illegal to help a slave to escape, obviously. Would that have been the right thing to do anyway? I think it would, but you tell me. So what about the here and now? Is there any law today in whatever country you live in that you believe would be wrong to obey and right to disobey? Is there any law, real or hypothetical, which you think would not only be right to disobey, but would be right to forcibly resist when the law enforcers try to force you to comply? Now that's a scary question for a lot of people. But I want you to keep clear in your head the difference between would you dare to do it and would you have the right? And let's be crystal clear what I'm asking. Is there any point at which you believe you would be justified in picking up a gun and pointing it at a cop to stop him from enforcing the law? Is there any scenario in which you could imagine that? If you're uncomfortable, good. Because this question has been answered wrong by millions and millions and millions of people, and that's why we can read about the regimes of Mao and Stalin and Hitler, because nobody freaking resisted them. This one is very important. This is sort of the crux of the matter. At the end of the day, who decides right and wrong for you? If there is a conflict between what your own conscience and moral code tells you and what government and authority command, which one outranks the other in your mind? Which takes precedence? Which one should you listen to? Which one should you follow? Is there any point at which you would resist legalized injustice? Is there any situation in which you would do what you know you should instead of what authority tells you you must? Let me ask the same thing in a different way to make it a little bit more uncomfortable for a lot of people out there. At the end of the day, do you think it is your place to pick and choose which laws you should obey? I think it is your place to do exactly that. But you tell me. Okay, I will end this with some personal opinions of my own, and you can decide whether you agree or disagree with each. As long as you are not committing assault or theft, all of those really bad shouldn'ts, I don't want anyone using force against you. I wouldn't do it myself. I wouldn't ask someone else to do it. I wouldn't hire someone else to do it, and I wouldn't vote or advocate that government do it for me. But even more importantly of what I vote for and whether I ask someone to do that, I want you to use your own conscience, your own moral code, relying on your own priorities, preferences, and values to make your own choices in life instead of you deferring to what any supposed authority, political otherwise, commands you to do. If there's a conflict between what government and law tell you to do and what you yourself feel is right, I hope that you will break the law and do what you think is right. Now, keep in mind, for the vast majority of people who will eventually hear this, I don't even know you. I don't even know who I'm talking to. Does a complete stranger trust your judgment more than you do? Now, I don't want you to commit force or fraud against anyone else, and if you do, I hope somebody tries to stop you, using force if they have to. But as long as you don't commit force or fraud or any of those really bad shouldn'ts, I don't want anyone ever using coercion or violence against you on their own or by way of a hired thug or by way of law and government. I don't want anyone robbing you, meddling in your life, trying to make your choices for you, trying to limit your options. I don't want anyone acting like they are your rightful master, and I don't want you thinking or acting like you are anyone's rightful subject or slave. I want you to be thoughtful and responsible, not timid and obedient. I want you to use your own mind and heart to decide what you should do rather than mindlessly bowing to any authority. Here is the punchline. I don't even know you, and I still want you to trust in your own goodness and wisdom rather than trusting in the supposed goodness and wisdom of those who seek positions of political power. And how freaking weird would it be if a complete stranger wants that for you more than you want it for yourself? Thank you for listening, and thank you for thinking.